the Arctic is melting, and with it, a quiet illusion about power, distance, and security is melting too. Just days after a dramatic US operation in Venezuela, President Trump looked north and said something that sounded almost surreal. We need Greenland for national security. At first glance, it feels like provocation, a soundbite, a throwback to an old headline. But look closer, and Greenland is no longer a frozen afterthought. It is a vault of rare earths, a choke point for future shipping lanes, a front line in a competition the United States cannot afford to lose. In a world where a single export restriction can halt factories and ground supply chains, minerals are no longer just commodities. They are leverage. They are power. And if you want to understand why Greenland suddenly matters so much, not just to Washington, but to Beijing and Brussels as well, stay with me. Because this story is not about buying land. It's about how geography is rewriting global security in real time. And to see why this question even exists, we have to define the problem first. The problem is not Greenland itself. The problem is what the world now depends on and who controls it. Modern economies run on materials most people never see. Rare earth elements sit inside fighter jets, satellites, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and precision-guided weapons. Without them, advanced technology slows. Without them, military readiness erodes. Today, the United States and its allies face a dangerous imbalance. China dominates rare earth mining and, more importantly, processing. That dominance has already been used as a pressure tool through export controls, disrupting Western supply chains and exposing how fragile industrial systems really are. Washington knows this. That is why recent US policy has shifted from market efficiency to resource security. Deals with domestic producers, agreements with trusted partners, and now renewed attention on regions that were once dismissed as too remote or too difficult. Greenland sits at the intersection of this vulnerability. It holds massive reserves, yet produces nothing. It is strategically located, yet politically constrained. To understand how this contradiction emerged, we need to step back and examine how Greenland arrived at this moment in history. For most of modern history, Greenland was valuable not for what lay beneath its ground, but for where it sat on the map. During World War II, the island became a forward outpost. Airfields, naval stations, early warning systems pointed toward Europe and the Soviet Union. When the war ended, the strategic logic stayed. Today, that legacy survives at Pituffik Space Base, the northernmost US military installation, watching missiles and tracking objects in space. But something else has changed quietly in the background. Climate, as Arctic ice retreats, geography itself is being renegotiated. Shipping routes, once locked behind ice, are beginning to open. The Northwest Passage could soon shorten travel between East Asia and Europe by thousands of kilometers, bypassing canals, choke points, and political risk. At the same time, melting ice is exposing mineral deposits that were once unreachable. Rare earths, uranium, graphite, and critical metals are no longer theoretical assets. They are becoming accessible. Greenland now sits where climate change, security, and supply chains collide. And when those forces align, competition inevitably follows. That collision sets the stage for the first real crisis. The first rupture came not from the ice, but from Beijing. In 2025, China tightened export controls on heavy rare earth elements. The impact was immediate. Automotive plants slowed, defense suppliers faced delays. Entire production lines paused, not because of labor or energy, but because a few grams of specialized material was suddenly unavailable. This was the moment when theory became reality. Supply chain dependence was no longer an abstract risk. It was measurable and painful. In Washington, the response was swift and revealing. The United States moved to secure equity stakes in domestic producers. It struck bilateral deals with partners like Japan and Australia and it looked outward, searching for deposits that could shift the balance. Greenland moved from the margins to the center of that search. With the world's 8th largest rare earth reserves and 2 of the largest undeveloped deposits on the planet, the island suddenly represented something rare: potential leverage. But potential is not production. Harsh climate, political resistance, and missing infrastructure stood in the way. And as American interest intensified, another question quietly surfaced. If the United States hesitated, who would step in instead? If you're finding this analysis useful, take a moment to stay engaged. Because the real story lies beneath the surface, in the system few people talk about. To see it, we need to examine the hidden mechanisms that decide who actually controls resources like these. What determines control over rare earths is not the ground. It is everything that comes after extraction. Mining is only the first gate. Processing is the real bottleneck. Separating rare earths is chemically complex, capital intensive, and environmentally sensitive. And today, China dominates that stage almost entirely. This is the hidden mechanism shaping Greenland's fate. Greenland can sit on millions of tons of rare earths and still remain dependent unless someone builds the infrastructure, the processing pathways, and the financing architecture around it. Without ports, power, roads, and predictable regulation, minerals stay trapped in the rock. This is where geopolitics quietly enters the balance sheet. China does not just offer capital, it offers end-to-end capability: mining, processing, offtake, market access. Western partners move differently. More rules, more conditions, more time. Greenland's leaders have made their preference clear. They want Western alignment. But preference does not replace feasibility. Already, Chinese firms hold minority stakes and processing agreements tied to Greenlandic deposits. Not dominance, but presence. And presence matters, because if infrastructure is built by one power and processing is controlled by another, sovereignty becomes conditional. That reality pushes Greenland toward a second, more dangerous inflection point. The second crisis is unfolding more quietly, but it may prove more decisive. Greenland does not lack minerals. It lacks roads, ports, power. An island 3 times the size of Texas has fewer than 100 miles of roads. Ports with limited capacity. Airports designed for prop planes, not industrial cargo. Electric grids that barely serve existing towns, let alone energy-intensive mining. This is where ambition collides with reality. Building a rare earth mine in Greenland is not just an engineering challenge. It is a nation-building exercise. Every project must first create the systems that make extraction possible. China understands this dynamic well. Infrastructure is influence. Airports, ports, logistics corridors are not neutral assets in the Arctic. They shape access, dependencies, and long-term alignment. That is why past Chinese bids to build Greenland's airports raised alarms in Washington and Copenhagen, and why Denmark ultimately stepped in to block them. But blocking does not solve the underlying problem. Greenland still needs development, and development still needs capital. As climate pressure, economic aspirations, and geopolitical competition converge, delay becomes its own risk. Because if trusted partners do not move fast enough, alternatives become harder to refuse. And that brings the story closer to the people who live on the island itself. For the people of Greenland, this is not a strategic chessboard. It is home. If you live in the south, near Narsak, mining is not an abstract policy debate. It is about fishing grounds, sheep farms, clean water, health. You have watched projects arrive with promises, then stall under political reversals and court battles. You have seen communities split between economic hope and environmental fear. Jobs versus risk, independence versus uncertainty. When uranium enters the conversation, trust breaks down fast. Radioactive waste is not theoretical to families who depend on land and sea for survival. That is why protests grew, why elections turned into referendums on mining, why laws changed overnight. And yet, you also feel the pressure of dependence, limited jobs, limited infrastructure, an economy tied to subsidies and external decisions. This is the human fault line beneath Greenland's resource debate. Not ideology, livelihood. If this story matters to you, remember this moment, because the choices made now will shape who benefits, who bears the risk, and who decides Greenland's future. That human tension inevitably spills beyond the island itself. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. The Arctic is no longer a frozen buffer. It is a corridor, a stage where global power is repositioning. As ice recedes, new shipping routes emerge. Routes that can cut thousands of kilometers off global trade. Routes that bypass traditional choke points like the Panama Canal. Greenland sits beside those lanes, close enough to observe, close enough to influence. For the United States, this is about maintaining strategic depth in the North Atlantic and Arctic. For Europe, it is about supply chain resilience and regulatory alignment. For China, it is about access and optionality in a region where it has been repeatedly blocked. This is why rare earths, graphite, ports, and radar stations cannot be separated. They form a single system. A mine without infrastructure invites foreign control. Infrastructure without alignment invites strategic risk. And disengagement invites someone else to write the rules. The question is no longer whether Greenland matters. The question is how the future unfolds from here. To answer that, we need to look forward. From here, 3 futures emerge. None are guaranteed. All are plausible. In the first scenario, cooperation wins. The United States works with Europe, not around it. Infrastructure corridors are planned jointly. Financing aligns with policy. Greenland develops its resources slowly, but on its own terms. Rare earths and graphite flow into diversified supply chains. Local communities see jobs, training, and revenue before production peaks. China remains present but peripheral. This is the stable path. Not fast, not dramatic, but resilient. In the second scenario, momentum stalls. Political hesitation delays projects. Regulatory uncertainty freezes capital. Infrastructure remains fragmented. Greenland's minerals stay underground, while global competition accelerates elsewhere. Dependence deepens, not on China directly, but on subsidies and external decisions. Opportunity costs accumulate quietly. This is the path of drift. The third scenario is sharper. Western partners move too slowly. Investment gaps widen. Greenland turns pragmatically to whoever can build first. Infrastructure arrives, but with strings. Processing routes lock in dependency. Sovereignty becomes conditional, not lost outright, but constrained. This is the path of strategic capture. Which future prevails depends on choices made now. And those choices lead us to the final insight. Greenland will not be won with a purchase offer, a headline, or a military gesture. It will be shaped by patience, by investment that arrives before desperation, by partnerships that respect sovereignty while delivering real capacity. The Tanbreeze mine is not just a deposit. It is a test of whether the United States and its allies can match ambition with follow-through, of whether security policy can translate into ports, power lines, and paychecks. If Washington treats Greenland only as a strategic asset, it will fail. If it treats Greenland as a partner, it may succeed. Because in the Arctic, influence is built quietly, through infrastructure, through trust, through choices that last longer than any administration. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new Arctic chapter. If you want to understand how resources are reshaping global power, stay with me, because the next frontier is already opening.